Good morning. I'm Jean Sherrill. I'm the Vice Regent from North Carolina of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and it is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Ned Kennedy is the Director of Museum Services at James Madison's Montpelier, where she has led the curatorial department since 2011. She oversees this important site's historical research projects, mansion interiors restoration and refurnishings efforts, exhibitions, and Montpelier's diverse and growing collections, including the manuscript archives and the architectural collections. Prior to her arrival at Montpelier, Meg worked as an editor and writer for a variety of academic publications, including the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth, and in the academic division of several 4 through K publishing houses, notably McGraw-Hill. Earlier in her career, she served as a social science research assistant for faculty at Amherst College and Princeton University, where she aided research on civil society in Southern Europe. She has volunteered extensively at the University of Virginia's Small Special Collections, where she processed archival materials related to the career of U.S. Senator and Connecticut Governor Lowell Weicker. Meg earned her master's degree in U.S. history and completed doctoral coursework in American cultural and social history at the University of Massachusetts 5-college graduate program in history. Her master's thesis explored colonial revival memorialization in New England, particularly through the anti-modernist collecting work of Clara Endicott Sears at Fruitlands. Meg lives in Charlottesville with her husband, Ben, and when not working, she is an avid gardener, photographer, and reader. She's here today to discuss Dali Madison and the emergence of a domestic aesthetic at Montpelier. Please join me in welcoming Ned Kennedy.
Thank you, Jean. That was far too kind for a Sunday morning. Thanks to Susan and the team at Mount Vernon. I don't think you could have set up my talk better through the weekend's conversation. So I think what I'll talk about today is oddly reminiscent of what we've been hearing. I'll start first with how most of us may think of Dali Madison these days. And I was quite taken with the idea that Betsy Ross was the historical girlfriend of James Madison. I don't know how Dali would feel about that. But Dali Madison is probably today best known for the ice cream and packaged cupcakes that bore her name throughout the 20th century, and the result of some smart marketing and branding that positioned her as a warm Southern belle who was always prepared. And I think this was an interesting outgrowth of Dali's actual historical character. And positioning her as a hostess is probably a double-edged sword for her. And I anecdotally say that today at Montpelier, probably the majority of our visitors are likely to be more familiar with Dali's legacy, or at least what they think of Dali, than of James Madison's, father of the Constitution and architect of the Bill of Rights, sometimes secondary to her charisma and charm. But in a sense, this is actually fitting. In the 19th century, Madison was content to work behind the scenes. His work was largely to support other politicians who took a more public role, while Dali's strength was really with people. Her longtime friend, Margaret Bayard Smith, who was Dali's first biographer, wrote of Montpelier that hospitality is the presiding genius in this house, and Mrs. M is kindness personified. And comments like this were typical of visitors to Montpelier and of visits with Dali generally. Both then and now, Dali's legacy represents more than just hospitality, though, and that's what I'll talk about today. It also represents more than just dessert, though I'm sure she's glad we're all still talking about her. As recent scholarship has brought to light, particularly some wonderful biographies by my colleague Catherine Algor, Dali was undeniably a public figure and even an international figure, probably in contrast to some of the other early first ladies. A product of her generation and circumstances, she was at the heart of a complex community network of friends and family that strengthened and defined her legacy. It's easy to reduce Dali, what one friend called of Dali, her generosity of spirit, to her role as a hostess and a friend. But in reality, in early Washington society, Dali was not just cultivating spirit, but also power, political power, as well as social and cultural power. She expanded the role of the president's wife. She was sometimes called the Lady Presidentess, to that of the First Lady, a role that and title that were defined ultimately by Zachary Taylor in his eulogy of Dali in 1849. Throughout her husband's career, and even after her death, Dali, even after his death, she used her position to affect policy in Washington through patronage and persuasion, the soft side of patronage. And probably most importantly, she helped reshape the fledgling American diplomacy that was suffering under, Sumter just painted a very sympathetic picture of Jefferson that I will somewhat disparage here. It's striking today to think that Dali, who was born on the southern frontier in the New Garden Quaker outpost that developed on the Great Wagon Road in North Carolina, and she was raised in rural Virginia during the Revolution in a Quaker community, lived decidedly into a modern era, such that she was photographed by Matthew Brady, and she even had him take a daguerreotype of her favorite likeness, the Gilbert Stuart portrait taken while Madison was Secretary of State. And she also posed for Brady with the Polk family, which just illuminates the sheer length of her career and her tenure in Washington, that she lived to know all the presidents, Washington through, we think, Lincoln. Pretty large-scale life. The University of Virginia has recently been undergoing transcription work of Dali's large letter collection, and we heard throughout the conference about the lack of women's papers. Dali is an exception to this. There are thousands of papers, pieces of correspondence, notes that relate to her life that are in her hand. And the transcription work has shed light on how complex her life was. It was sometimes even dark, and spanned 8 decades. She lived long after James Madison. It was filled with the trials of the 18th and 19th century, the loss of close family, children, and her favorite siblings, but also the extraordinary circumstances that propelled her into such a public role. When Virginia law made it possible to legally manumit slaves, her father, who was a convert to the Quaker Society of Friends, manumitted his, as he was called to do by the Quaker meeting, but was then unable to maintain a plantation without slave labor, which forced the family to move north to Philadelphia. This is a slide several of my fellow speakers have shown. The Quaker community in the 1780s was well established at that point, and Dali's father was taken in to it with an orthodoxy that was probably typical of his conversion, but that didn't seem to suit the rest of the family, almost all of whom ultimately left the faith or were written out of the meeting through marriage. A friend in the community described Dali even then as inclined for the gaieties of this world. In this new urban environment in Philadelphia, her father failed to gain an economic foothold as a starch manufacturer. So it makes me wonder if he knew Betsy and the other Quaker textile workers in the city. But this led Dali's mother to, like the mother of Eliza House Trist, to take in boarders to make ends meet, which ultimately proved fortunate for Dali, because through her mother's boarder, Aaron Burr, she eventually met James Madison. But at the time, it was a painful reminder of the family's precarious economic footing and really showcased their differences in a community that favored, if not conformity, plainness. Dali married advantageously at age 22 to John Todd, who was a promising young lawyer in the community. And like she'd later find with James Madison, John Todd's support of Dali didn't fail when her father's fortunes turned, as would some of her other family members later in life, and when her sister was read out of the Quaker meeting, and probably what she took to most in John Todd. And from inventories, we know that Dali was, decorated their Philadelphia home in high Quaker style. These are hard to read, but some of the highlights include looking glasses, silver imported ceramics, mahogany chairs, a walnut table with drawers, a large gilt frame, and the newly desirable piece of furniture in any home in Philadelphia, a sideboard. Dali had 2 sons within the first 2 years of her marriage, but shortly thereafter faced radical upheaval as the yellow fever epidemic took hold in Philadelphia. Believing that they might somehow avoid contagion, because no one was quite sure how yellow fever was spreading, Dali and the children went across the Schuylkill River to Gray's Ferry, where they waited out the epidemic. Within several weeks, she lost both of her in-laws, John Todd's parents, her husband, and her infant son. The year that followed was understandingly tumultuous for Dali. And in addition to the loss she had just experienced, she was embroiled in a long, protracted legal battle with her surviving brother-in-law, who withheld her portion of the family inheritance, leaving her in an economically precarious position. The legal case is particularly important to us as researchers because it details how fiercely Dali was protecting her young son's inheritance. In a particularly harried, pointed letter to her brother-in-law, Dali made clear that she would rather go hungry than part with her husband's books. She wrote, "Books from which he wishes his child improved shall remain sacred, and I would feel the pinching hand of poverty before I disposed of them." Before the year was out, Dali was introduced to a 43-year-old bachelor congressman from Virginia, the not as charming James Madison, who was an emerging member of a political elite in the temporary capital and who was equally a member of an established Virginia planter family. They agreed to marry, though James Madison wasn't necessarily an obvious choice because marrying him ensured that Dali would be not only written out of the Quaker community, but also that she would have to eventually relocate to Virginia. However, in her letters, it's clear that Dali found comfort in Madison's even temper and dependability. And as much as he didn't want his adversaries to know, I think you can even see in this this likeness of him that he was good-natured and funny, his sly look to him. And more importantly, he agreed to take on her young son, Payne Todd. Theirs was clearly an 18th century practical view of marriage, one that ultimately evolved into a great political and social partnership. In 1797, though, fearing the end of his career with the election of John Adams, James Madison, like Thomas Jefferson, retired back to Virginia, and James and Dali moved to Montpelier, his parents' home, where they built a small house that adjoined his parents'. So I skipped over Dali's engagement ring. Through primogeniture, the Madisons knew that they would assume eventual ownership of the house, so they built this townhouse-style structure that was appended to his parents' house. It was undoubtedly influenced by Dali and their time in Philadelphia because it is a 2/2 clearly modeled after Philadelphia houses they were familiar with. And it through a front porch or through Madison's library upstairs were the only 2 ways to get between the houses. So I'm always curious if anyone has examples of this beyond the Roosevelts, these appended houses, especially in this period. And Madison added a portico, that very Palladian federal element that joined the house together. The Madisons' home was filled with items from Philadelphia that they shipped to Montpelier via the port at Fredericksburg. Their agent, James Blair, wrote that no opportunity shall be lost in forwarding the articles you've ordered to be sent there, though the transition drew out over many months. And in addition to dozens of trunks and boxes, Madison's agent recorded the arrival of not only a dozen Windsor chairs and half a dozen mahogany chairs. He noted that the bottoms, I suppose, are packed up in the crates. When the townhouse was eventually completed, it was furnished with these Philadelphia items, Quaker pieces that Dali inherited through the death of her first husband, and several important items bought by James Monroe, who agreed to to shop on their behalf in France, not unlike the proxy shoppers that Amy told us about yesterday. Asking for Monroe's help to act in this capacity, Madison wrote, "The wants incident to my new situation seduce me into an unwilling tax on your goodness," which was his way of saying he had recently gotten married and needed furniture. The list included what Madison called a chimney clock, china service, 2 carpets of different sizes, which is very typical of Madison. 2 carpets of different sizes does not tell you which 2 sizes, as well as some larger pieces like a chic polonaise bed, which Monroe sent outfitted with mattresses and curtains. Madison hoped that the, quote, many articles of furniture at second hand may be had in Paris, we think because of the recent revolution and unrest. More importantly, he noted, I leave the particular directions entirely to your own judgment, to which I would pray the addition of a hint from Mrs. Monroe's better one. He concluded by asking that if the task didn't burden the Monroes too much, he would ask the favor of you to go beyond the enumerated articles into others which you may know to be acceptable to a young homemaker. When the items arrived, surely it was not Madison, who had lived most of his adult life in boarding houses, particularly the one Sumter just showed us, and collected only books during those 43 years. But it must have been Dali, the young housekeeper, who noticed that the fabric that was sent with the polonaise bed was not of damask, but of an inferior and cheaper sort of silk. And ever practical, Madison enclosed samples of the pieces in a return note to France, asking Monroe to seek a refund for the error. Shortly after they settled into their new home at Montpelier, Jefferson was elected president in 1801, and the Madisons left for Washington, where they would spend ultimately the next 16 years. And Washington, we all know from the talks we've been hearing, was at best in 1801 still under construction, and it was, especially compared to Philadelphia, a muddy and lonely place that lacked a thriving mercantile center. Because Jefferson's daughters remain largely at Monticello, he asked that Dali serve occasionally as his hostess and initiate, quote, an acquaintance with the ladies of the place in Washington, which propelled her first into her public role. As the Secretary of State's wife, she called on everyone in town. There are calling cards in many collections that confirm this. And she was particularly gracious to new arrivals in Washington, which was such a transitory town, and probably still is. Thanks to Margaret Baird Smith, who I mentioned earlier, who was the wife of the administration's newspaper at the time, Margaret Baird Smith kept wonderful day books of Washington society, and we know what Dali was doing many days in Washington thanks to those day books, which put her at the houses of Anna Maria Thornton, whose husband was designing the Capitol, the Talos, the Custuses, all of the major families in Washington. And one of her first real roles was raising money for the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was underfunded by the federal government. Early in his administration, Jefferson, and this is, I'm sorry, where I get a little critical of Jefferson, he broke with his predecessors and abolished many of the public events at the executive mansion, including levees, those large parties held on the first of the year, which he felt were akin to holding court. Jefferson was trying to establish himself as a Republican, not a member of a monarch, and he instituted what he called pell-mell, which is a very Jeffersonian and Madison idea from the Latin to tumble, where he held small dinner parties, typically with members of the same political party and frequently without their spouses. He encouraged informal attire, and there are many accounts of him answering the door in his boots or his slippers. And he favored round dining tables that had no head. It's clear to us today and to Jefferson and Madison at the time that he was designing these practices to foster Republican values and to encourage open communication. But they were seen, these elite parties were seen by many as at best chilly and at worst manipulative, which further increased partisan divides in Washington and certainly alienated newcomers. And this all comes to a head, pell-mell meeting its match at a dinner party to welcome the visiting British minister plenipotentiary Anthony Merry, who had just arrived with his wife in Washington. When dinner was called, Jefferson took the arm of Dali, who was standing nearest him, and led her to the table. Mrs. Merry, though, was prepared for European diplomatic customs and took grave offense at Jefferson's actions, which were essentially an affront to her official introduction in Washington. And both Jefferson and Madison are culpable in what followed afterwards, several clumsy and overtly inconsiderate encounters with the Marys that led the Marys to believe that the American cabinet was decidedly pro-French and anti-British. And the debacles turned into a national conversation. And it seems maybe minor to us today when we read the newspaper, but this story was seized upon by the media, and Dali became sort of a stand-in, seen as a tool in the president's arsenal. And characterizations of her and Mrs. Merry were used as stand-ins to discuss the mounting international tension between the U.S. and Britain. It's no doubt that the what was called the Merry Affair had a profound effect on Dali, who understood the importance of diplomacy, particularly for a young and volatile nation. And this is the years before social secretaries. Dali clearly used the Merry Affair to influence the practices and procedures she enacted as First Lady. Beginning with Madison's inauguration in March of 1809, she made several deliberate choices. Madison wore a suit of domestically produced merino wool, which was part of this was at the height of the merino wool fad in America, but it also emphasized American-made material, especially during an embargo. Though a European visitor noted that she looked and moved a queen, Dali was careful to wear pearls and not the undemocratic diamonds of the royal monarchs and of Mrs. Merry when she attended the inaugural ball. In all her style choices during the presidency, Dali skirted that fine line between appearing both befitting the role and simultaneously not ostentatious during a period that was romanticizing Republican simplicity. Even before the inauguration, Dali began designing public rooms at the president's house with Henry Latrobe, who acted as a shopper for her in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. Dali pointedly chose American-made pieces when possible and emphasized American themes in the house's artwork, including the middle-class Finley chairs Ulysses talked to us about on Friday. She and Latrobe were proud that they had worked within the congressionally allotted budget, which is something I suspect was drilled into Dali throughout her relationship with Madison, a recurring theme in her letters. Latrobe Winlatrobe reported to Dali that crimson damask was unavailable for curtains in the president's house, she made do with velvet, waiting until she returned to Montpelier in 1817 to use them in her drawing room. Though as a Quaker she never learned to play music or to dance, she filled the president's house and Montpelier with musical instruments to encourage socializing. As soon as the parlor at the president's house was completed, she hosted her first public event, what she called a drawing room, where everyone who had been introduced to the Madisons was welcome to attend, women included. This is a conjectural sketch of what that might have looked like. The parties were held most Wednesdays when the government was in session and were so well attended by both sides of the aisle that they were often called squeezes. You had to squeeze your way through. At the drawing rooms, Dali directed the service of tea and wine, ice cream, of course, hence her legacy. And she typically carried with her a novel or a book of poetry, the latest book imprint she could find, which she used as a neutral topic to spark conversation among people she met. But two years into the War of 1812, during the Madison second term, the nation waited as British troops marched into Washington. I was struck by what Marla told us about the mounting tensions in Philadelphia, waiting for troops to arrive during the Revolution, and something similar was happening in the War of 1812. For weeks, Dali lived under, I think what today we'd call terrorism. Basically, the mounting fear that her home would be invaded. British generals even threatened to capture her and bring her back to England as a spoil of the war. When British arrival was imminent and Madison had to rush to meet with his generals, he beseeched her to, quote, take care of myself and of the cabinet papers, public and private. Under her direction, the enslaved domestic servants at the president's house filled crates with important documents, and Dali wrote to her sister, our private property must be sacrificed. Before leaving with Charles Carroll, who she said was in a very bad humor with me, Dali insisted on waiting until the large portrait of General Washington is secured. And much has been made about this moment, and surely I think we all know today that, and Dali knew then, that the portrait was a copy and not in and of itself critically important as a piece of art. She was well aware of the psychological importance of saving the painting from the British, who she was afraid would deface or destroy it, along with the house. She understood the power of its symbolic value and took seriously her role in securing it. She wrote about it much later in her life. A minor gesture, but one that helped perpetuate her legacy. Paradoxically, because of the War of 1812 and the destruction of the president's house, we actually know quite a bit about the Madisons' furnishing habits, thanks to the miscellaneous treasury accounts that are kept by the federal government, spending receipts. We can track the first family's acquisitions of an entire household of goods for their temporary quarters, including all of the cleaning items they needed, brooms and dustpans, to things like this order of 5 dozen secondhand glass tumblers, 2 dozen water goblets, 2 dozen champagne flutes, 4 dozen wine glasses, and 2 dozen jelly glasses, as well as a green-painted bathing tub. These accounts even notate that the Madisons bought some objects back from the government following the presidency, including a set of gray and gold fancy chairs made in New York by William Palmer, and a couch on casters that was made locally here by William Worthington. The Madisons' elaborate 200-piece Nast service, which had been secured for use at Montpelier by a diplomatic agent, Fuller Skipwith, was wagoned up from Orange and served as their presidential porcelain after the destruction of the president's house. With the shipment, Skipwith wrote, "The china in whiteness is not much inferior to the china of the celebrated manufactory at Sèvres and is 40% cheaper." I might I might have pleased myself better in my choice among much dearer sets of china, but no one in the manufactories nowhere could I select a table and dessert set so good and so neat at the price paid for me by yours. If Dali liked the orange pattern when it arrived sight unseen in 1806, she never mentioned it in her letters, and visitors failed to mention it at Montpelier, though we know from archaeological evidence that it was there. But I think she would be pleased to know that it lives on in the Obama's newly designed service. To understand Dali's style is impossible without understanding her fluctuating access to market goods. In orange, which I think I can safely say still can feel isolated some days, the Madisons were largely dependent on the sale of tobacco and wheat on the European market, as we've been hearing about throughout the symposium, which was sold through a factor who sent back requested goods, in the Madisons' case from Liverpool, or from agents like Skipwith who were acting on their behalf. The Madisons long relied on this factor system far after their other peers had dropped away from it. And we think that might be in part because of their lack of access to a major city where they could shop. They were caught in the midst of a looming recession and poor crops, selling on the European market thanks to the Hessian fly and droughts. And the embargoes through the Madison and Jefferson administrations were stifling trade and further limiting the Madisons' access to market goods. This left Dali and many of her peers reliant on a thriving network of secondhand purchases. She in particular took advantage of sales as foreign diplomats departed from Washington and even earlier from Philadelphia. And we believe that the Madisons bought a set of French chairs at President Washington's executive mansion sale in Philadelphia after his presidency. During their retirement, when the Madisons were almost exclusively at Montpelier, Fredericksburg was their chief mercantile hub. As she had done with Latrobe at the President's house, Dali's correspondence to friends in larger cities is littered with requests for modern and stylish goods to be shipped to her at Montpelier, including 2 secondhand carpets cheap. Which I just, again, the Madisons, their vague orders. When she traveled to Richmond and Washington, which was infrequently, she delighted in acting as a shopper for her friends in the area, particularly Martha Jefferson Randolph at Monticello. From textiles, carpets, and mirrors to feathers in her famous turbans, there's a request for feathers in this list. She was reliant on the careful decisions of friends, family, and agents who were all shopping for her. In this particular list, Dali requested not only silk and lace, 24 pairs of white kid gloves long, a print of the bust of N. Bonaparte, large as life, 4 orange or bright yellow merino wool shawls not exceeding $12 or $15, 1 dozen fanciful but very cheap snuff boxes, and 100 yards of the best carpeting that can be had for $1 a yard. While plenty of the family's domestic orders for goods were in Madison's hand, as we've been learning throughout the symposium, we've long assumed Dali played a much larger, more active and deliberate role in refurnishing Montpelier. Furnishing choices throughout the house mimic what she did at the President's house, which was well documented. Just 2 weeks ago, we reopened the Madisons' newly restored bedchamber. And as with all of our refurnishing projects at Montpelier, we utilized extant architectural evidence. There were great pinholes in for curtain tiebacks in the architraves of the windows, and physical evidence like a fragment of period wallpaper on the cornice of a bed with Madison provenance. All of those clues helped us understand how the Madisons lived at Montpelier in the early 19th century. But for several months, my staff and I were deliberating over a reference to fabric in a letter that we date circa 1820 that seemed particularly important, in which Madison ordered textiles for the bed. And you can see there are 4 pieces of furniture chintz of lively colors, with fringe to suit it all for bed and windows of the same room. It wasn't until we pulled a photograph, though, of the original manuscript, instead of just relying on the transcription, the original manuscript is at the New York Public Library, that we noticed something important. While the letter to the factor is in James Madison's hand, the reference to chintz was written along the folded edge. I don't know if you can quite make that out, but it's written in Dali's hand, that part of it, confirming both literally and figuratively her hand in the creation of Montpelier. In all else in her life, Dali made do with what was available and what arrived, favoring comfort and ease of her guests over style that she could specifically detail. Visitors to Montpelier routinely commented on the graciousness of their hosts and the simple but abundant meals, which their critics often said were country meals, served at their enormous dining room table. To her sister, Dali wrote during the presidency, "I'm less worried here with 100 guests than with 25 in Washington." Montpelier's drawing room, where most visitors were received, was described as a museum of the arts by generous visitors, cluttered by less generous visitors. Crimson on red was the color scheme that visitors noted, and filled in every nook and cranny with things like reductions of the ancients, which we believe are small busts of Homer and Socrates, Athena, which were up on the pediments above the doors, and looking glasses, which Dali ordered large as can be bought for $100, which flanked the door into the room. The room was decidedly French-inspired, but of course through the domestic lens of the Madisons, neither of whom had traveled abroad. There's fine art on the walls, including a 17th century Dutch masterwork that Dali's son won in a gambling match in Europe, and Madison had to pay the Baring Brothers firm for costs associated with the crating of it. A pianoforte, a chess set, an electrostatic generator, which the Madisons called an electrical machine, and busts of Madison's colleagues and mentors. As she prepared to return to Montpelier following the presidency, Dali was both nervous to be isolated again back in the country, but looking forward to somewhat of a retirement. She wrote to her good friend Hannah Gallatin, who was the wife of the former Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, who were now in France serving a diplomatic commission. In the letter, Dali, of course, asks after the children and sends gossip about friends, and finally asks Hannah for some help. Quote, "Mr. Madison has proposed that I ask you," she wrote, "to choose 3 country curtains suited to my drawing room of silk, trimmed with cornices, all of reasonable price." But she concluded, "The color I leave to you." And in a parenthetical, "let it be red or variegated." This simple statement, sent to a friend whom Dali had entrusted with such a symbolic acquisition, perfectly summarizes her position and her life, bound to others, but mutually reliant on the creation of her home and of the nation. So please come visit. Can I take any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Clearly, it was sort of like anything we want, as long as it's red. What's the documentation, though, for the red silk damask or the crimson silk damask on the walls? Mm-hmm.
It is very unusual. We were actually quite lucky with that. we had a number of documentary accounts, visitor accounts of which I mentioned, crimson on red, which was curious. And we knew from a wonderful rodent nest that was found during Montpelier's restoration that there was crimson damask in the house. And also during the restoration, on the top of one of, actually, it might be the architrave above Franklin's bust, there was a tiny fragment about the size of your thumbnail of wallpaper that one of the craftsmen had missed when he was wallpapering. And we knew that from that fragment, there was a ground color of red and a flocked crimson on top, but we didn't know the pattern. So we had to rely on other period examples to choose the pattern. We're very lucky at Montpelier to have a great deal of physical evidence left through things like wallpaper fragments. Yes, Amy?
Can you tell us more about the transcription process, project of her papers? And
Sure.
Scholars have presumably read through all these letters even if they're not transcribed, or?
Amy asked about the transcription of Dali's letters. There have been active papers projects going on, especially the Madison papers have been going on since the 1940s and are extensive, and they collect all of the Dali correspondence when she's writing to Madison. But this new project, Holly Schulman heads up, has been remarkable in transcribing the bulk of Dali's correspondence, including all of the court cases, which are rich with information for us. So they're into the most generous way to say it, they're past Madison's death at this point in their transcription. So they're pretty extensive. They're wonderful. They're on many of them are online too. Yeah, thank you.
I've got another pair of sunglasses up here if anybody's lost them. I'm going to leave them right here on the counter, and we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to be back at half after.
I will tell her that we ask her, and maybe she'll come back with it. I would love to do that. But if not, I should feel really. Well, it's just that she actually didn't like
Jefferson did not design the chair.
I've got a change all
But he was instrumental in the popularization who is now living in the West Coast, who tracked all the early documentary records out of Venezuela. And I've been working on it from the north south, and we all feel pretty sure we know the specific course these artists they were making in the 1750s. We're trying to do all the genealogy. Being able to get into the basics, I don't want to get too much into this. There's going to be a big use.
I'm sorry. Well, and then right, it's all together so many different ideas that we've been hearing.
Mrs. Tracy, because we think probably the circulation is accurate.
They are uncomfortable. Yeah, I think they are. Yeah, and they are.
And they're cheap.
Yeah.
I wanted to see her before she left. She's gone now, but she must have been amazed. Now we have.
Yeah.
I'll be visiting her down there again.
Thinking differently about them.
Greater appreciation.
Yeah, my uncle was the gardener at Vernon Decorative, deer hatch, and he has one in his living room. And it's always the last chair that anybody sits in. Yeah, I think that one's impressive though.
Yes, I'll follow through with that, I promise.
And then everyone identifies.
I will look forward.
Well,
Well, but he also enjoyed it. The couches, plush couches, and the bar chairs, and all that. You know, we have so many options, right? So many options for comfy chairs. That was probably pretty good. Everybody's so much fun.
And they're just endearing things, whatever the public perception may be, and whatever these fallacies may have been, and whatever security situations, everything may have been. This place is domestic, very light in just the kind of the structure of this house. But she was, whether she was there or not, I think she was kind of in psychological.
Oh, you got it. But you want to make
It feels enormous. And it makes sense in lots of ways. You know.
Yes.
Do you want it to made out to you? Okay. For Janice.
Country too.
Do you do any container gardening on your terrace at your apartment?
We don't have a terrace.
Oh.
I did get some herbs, and the herbs that are passing.
I'll be back. But to get to know
Harvest the occasional bit of lettuce. It's quite a
My top tip.
I hope so. I really hope so. There you go. I love your
I want to give you
I tell Susan all the time, can I do anything else?
Yeah, right. Oh, so
Okay, I'm going to get some coffee quickly before you start.
Okay.
Had a lovely, brief introduction and greeting this morning with Carol and our donors of the small dining room. Mr.
Rival?
No. Of last year's project from New York City, Mr. Freeman. Who couldn't have been more thrilled to come and see him brought his family and a couple of grandsons for a tour. He was so moved just by walking into the APC and being greeted by Carol and Adam and me. I mean, it was really, you realize the power,
the touch
of that, and also just the presence of having been able to participate in our nation's history in that way. And this was really heartwarming.
If everybody will please take their seats.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we should probably take our seats and continue on because we're running a few minutes late. But I wouldn't have missed a word of what's been said. Just give us another minute or two to get people back. Well, before I get on with my remarks, I just have to say on behalf of, I think I can say this on behalf of Mount Vernon, representing all the constituencies, that from our point of view, I'm just astounded
at what I would consider the success of this conference. I hope that you've enjoyed the content. It seems as though you have. And from our perspective, it's just been so gratifying and exciting to realize that Mount Vernon can convene a conference of this sort at the highest level of scholarship. And it's been thrilling, really thrilling, I can't think of a better word, to see the interaction among the scholars and lecturers here and to see what you all have learned from one another. And I think we're spawning something terrific here, and which is what we had hoped that the library would become, and that what the element that would add to the Mount Vernon experience and the Mount Vernon reach and an impact on the world. And I think it's happening. And it's happened quickly, and it's only getting better. So I appreciate all of the speakers, all of you who have come together. I know that you will continue collaborating, and that will be good for the world of scholarship and the world in general. So it's a great pleasure. It's such a great privilege to be part of something like this. So thank you, and come back. And one personal note about these Campeche chairs, I encountered one over the last couple of years in Jamaica, actually with Jean Sherrill, who rents a house there. And in the living room are these chairs, which we have said to each other are horrible chairs. these chairs. We had I'm sure I looked for her earlier and I thought, Jean, these are the chairs. You can't get in them. You can't get out of them. And we say, why don't the owners get rid of these chairs? And now we'll have to be far more respectful. But I do think that if Thomas Jefferson ever encountered a lazy boy, he probably would have liked that better. My husband says if George Washington had known about vinyl siding, he probably would have put that up there. So, they were doing the most modern thing, but it's just a living story. So great to learn about those chairs. So getting back to the subject at hand. So as we close this event, it seems it's ironic and yet fitting to end at the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean the start of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association story. One of the most compelling tales of our nearly 160 years as the oldest preservation association in the nation is how the ladies initially furnished the mansion. These enterprising women had important contacts in virtually every state and put those contacts and their own ingenuity to good use as they began to restore both the interior and the exterior of Washington's home. Many of the rooms were, in a sense, adopted by individual vice-regents who gathered an assortment of antiques and other furnishings to serve as placeholders until the original Washington items could be located and, they hoped, accessioned through gifts, loans, or outright purchase. During that period, a surprising number of donors offered portraits of the general until the walls nearly began to sag under the weight of Washington's image. So you're in for a treat as Dr. Lydia Brandt elaborates on that period of Mount Vernon's history to close this terrific symposium. Lydia Matisse Brandt is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, where she teaches the history of American architecture, art, and material culture, and the theories and methods of historic preservation. Lydia is an art history graduate of the New York University, received her MA degree in architectural history at the University of Virginia, where she also was awarded a certificate in historic preservation, and in 2012 earned her PhD in art and architectural history from the University of Virginia. Her dissertation, I'm happy to say, was entitled Reliving Mount Vernon, Replicas and Memory of America's Most Famous House. Fittingly, Lydia was an inaugural fellow here at the National Library for the Study of George Washington in 2013-14. She's currently completing a book manuscript on Mount Vernon's image in popular American architecture. The working title, I believe, is First in the Homes of His Countrymen, George Washington's Mount Vernon in the American Imagination. We look forward to seeing that published in 2016. So we're very, very proud of Lydia and her scholarship and are delighted to welcome her sort of back home to Mount Vernon. Dr. Lydia Brandt.
What a pleasure to be here always at Mount Vernon with you all. And I think it's very fitting that we're ending, well, not just with me, but with the women who preserved many of the types of material culture that we've been talking about all weekend. And I'd like to thank Susan for inviting me, and also the ladies and Mount Vernon and the staff here for hosting me as a fellow in the inaugural class. This project grew out of my dissertation at the University of Virginia, as Mrs. Lucas said, and it became a completely different animal once I got access to the amazing collections, the building, and most importantly, the staff here at Mount Vernon. So my book would not have happened the way that it has without this fabulous new facility. So thank you for that. So it is very appropriate to end a weekend celebrating women's contributions to early American decorative arts with a story about how later generations of American women came to preserve them. The MVLA is always rightly credited as being the first national women's preservation organization, and Mount Vernon as the first proper house museum in America, but very few scholars have looked at how that actually happened. Most historians of historic preservation and of American history have explained the ladies' early choices as colonial revival. I am a historian of the colonial revival. Phony colony is my thing, but I don't think this is a sufficient explanation at all, because when the ladies first formed and started thinking about Mount Vernon as a house museum, the colonial revival was not a formed concept. It was in its absolute infancy in the cradle. So we have to start thinking about it in a different way. Writing off the early preservation efforts as just the first as a colonial revival effort also does not fully address the ambition with which the early board members approached preservation at Mount Vernon, and also the extreme hardships that they faced. And I want to lay out some of this at the beginning. There were no museums in the United States that interpreted domestic interiors in the 1850s. There were no women-owned historic sites, and there were very few things that we think of as historic sites at all. The fields of American decorative arts and American architectural history were virtually non-existent. Americans really weren't collecting antiques in a big way until the centennial, 25 years after the ladies began talking about Mount Vernon. All of the money that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association raised, the famous $200,000 to purchase Mount Vernon, went to John Augustine Washington. There was nothing left over for collections when they had the thing. So money was a major issue in the early decades of the organization. And then within months of their purchase, this little thing happened called the Civil War. So it really, you have to keep all of these things in mind, this context, to understand the amazing impact of this organization. So today I'd like to focus on the first 50 years of Mount Vernon. We'll bookend with these two images of the new room on the left and the museum that ultimately changed the way that the mansion was interpreted in the 1920s. Focus on this first 50 years of the organization to understand how Mount Vernon became America's first in situ collection of simulated domestic interiors. So pushing beyond that inaugural moment, one of the things I found, this is I get to plug my book here, because it's a room full of people that will actually be interested in it, unlike my students, or like, oh, Mount Vernon again.
what I found and what my book chronicles is that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and Mount Vernon has had many firsts over the years, many firsts. And I was in the presentation yesterday with Tom Reinhardt of the HBEM, which is yet another first, which is just amazing. And so my book will trace these different firsts that the ladies pioneered. When the Mount Vernon Ladies Association began campaigning in the 1850s, of course, led by Anne Pamela Cunningham, they had to pioneer all sorts of activities that we now take for granted in museums. And just campaigning for asking for money, figuring out how to do that, how to clarify and sell a message was something that they were having to figure out. And they began publishing the Mount Vernon Record in 1859. This was a kind of newsletter, much like Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, or the newsletters you might get from other historic preservation organizations you're a member of. And this kind of little newsletter, and it's varied in numbers of pages, compiled information about Mount Vernon and about the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And this was in part because many newspapers were refusing to publish their appeals or were saying ugly things about these women raising money that were coming from all over the country at the moment of the Civil War. So this is a way for them to control their image. So this in itself is fascinating. What I'm really interested in for today's talk is a shift that we see in the headline of these two examples of the record. Between 1859 and 1860, we see the ladies shifting the language in the main piece of their preservation campaign from devoted to the purchase of the home and grave of Washington to an organization devoted to the purchase and restoration of Washington's home. As a historian of historic preservation, this strikes me as very amazing, because restoration as a concept didn't really exist in the United States in 1859. It was something that was starting to be really theorized in Europe, mostly having to do with churches and other medieval buildings, but there was really no precedent for restoring an American building, never mind an American vernacular building. There was no canon for important American buildings. The first history of, if you can call it a history of American art and architecture, is published in 1834. Whoa. William Dunlap's book, of course. So talking about restoring a building in America is really revolutionary. The ladies explain their plan in this article to restore Mount Vernon, quote, from what it is to what it was, under the watchful care of the great chief who, although he lived for his country, never forgot nor neglected his much loved home. The idea here is relatively simple, but potentially incredibly powerful. Let's fix up the house, let's furnish it, and let's essentially recreate the physical space inhabited by George and Martha Washington. The idea here is that Mount Vernon greatly influenced Washington's character. The Cincinnatus myth was very much still had a big hold on the American population. And the idea was that if Mount Vernon greatly influenced Washington, then it could also influence future generations of Americans. And this is steeped in the idea of the Christian home in the mid-19th century. If you grow up in a happy, beautiful, and moral place, then you will grow up to be a contributing member of society, and you too might be George Washington. And so this is the idea behind this, that Washington's home, not just his house, but his home, would influence later generations. Okay, but how are they going to do this? They had no comparable examples at which to look. How did they know how to restore Mount Vernon? The only other house museum, if you want to call it that, in the United States at the time was Washington's headquarters at Newburgh, which was owned by the state of New York and had opened in 1950 as a public museum. But this was really more of a relic house than a simulated interior. It included objects related to Washington and his military career, but it really wasn't interpreted as a home. And the ladies knew they didn't want this. They did not want to be
They did not want Mount Vernon to be what they called a curiosity cabinet of relics. They really wanted Mount Vernon to feel like a house that Washington had just stepped out of, that in that presence, Americans would be inspired. No matter what they thought restoration might mean, recreating Washington's world at Mount Vernon was not going to be easy once they actually acquired the property in 1860. For one, it was virtually empty. And this is a print of the room in which Washington died from Benson Lossing's George Washington's Mount Vernon, published in 1859, which I'm making the bold claim is the first monograph on an American building. And he shows the room as most 19th century Americans, mid-19th century Americans would have seen it, which is empty. The furniture had been dispersed. So when the ladies purchased the building, there's only a few things in the house. Of course, the Houdon bust, the Bastille key is in situ, but they pretty much have to start from scratch in terms of furnishing it. The house also needed to serve as a residence, and I think this is a moment that often gets dropped out of the story of Mount Vernon. The first regent, Anne Pamela Cunningham, reserved rooms on the first floor, essentially creating a suite that you can see on the upper slide, and then rooms on the second floor were reserved for her chaperone. And others who I'll explain in a second lived in the house. And you might notice that on the second floor, I've labeled a room that is now known as the Blue Room as the General Lafayette's bedchamber. At this point in the 19th century, that was believed to be the room in which Lafayette had stayed when he visited the mansion. So Anne Pamela Cunningham reserved a room to dine in, Washington's study, a room to sleep in, the dining room, and a room to visit in, which was that front bedchamber. And then on the upper floors, Upton Herbert and Sarah Tracy, who became the custodians of Mount Vernon during the Civil War, they lived along with their chaperone. And of course, if you know anything about them, they get married after the war, forming this bond through keeping Mount Vernon safe through the Civil War. So just to make sure that they were kept in line, they had a chaperone, Marion McMakin. So people were living in Mount Vernon through the 1860s and into the 1870s. And there really was never any question when they were first talking about restoring the house as whether or not people would live here. It was assumed that Anne Pamela Cunningham would inhabit the house. And here's Sarah Tracy. When they first start bringing furniture in the house, it's to furnish the rooms that people will be living in. And Sarah Tracy wrote this very woeful letter to Anne Pamela, who was in South Carolina for most of the war at her family's plantation, saying, "Oh, I really need money for some shades for the windows because people are looking in at me dressing." And this is not, I need shades on the windows that look like the shades on the windows that Washington had. This is, I don't want people to see me naked. So the first impulse is to furnish the house in order to make these early custodians comfortable. And visitors explained bitterly. They came in the house and all of the doors to these rooms that are shaded yellow were closed. The house felt empty, it felt sad, and the public's expectations were unreasonable, but understandable. They had waited a long time for this to be a museum. I gave my $1. I should be able to see all the rooms. And people wrote letters like this to the board, very, very frustrated. Anne Pamela Cunningham and her attendants move out of the house in the winter of 1873. And that's the moment that I see as really the start of Mount Vernon as a house museum in the way that we think of it now in the 21st century. And there's a great flurry of activity in anticipation of fixing up the house for the centennial in 1876, a year in which 13,000 people would come here, which is kind of bananas at that moment. But Mount Vernon's not going to become a museum overnight. let me introduce you to the first curator of Mount Vernon. And I use that word with confidence. This is Nancy Halston. She was the vice regent for New Jersey, and she was a tour de force. She was a very close confidant of Anne Pamela Cunningham. So when Anne Pamela steps down from the board in 1873-74, Mrs. Halsted is given a lot of control and trust. And she gets right to business. How are we going to make this Washington's home? Well, first she comes up with the idea to divvy up rooms amongst the regents. So each of the rooms is given to a state, delegating the furnishing of the house. And this is to help things go faster. And the rooms are identified with individual states well into the 1920s. With cost in mind, she arranges for a steamship to deliver furniture for free from ports in New York and New Jersey. And she also writes to the Smithsonian Institution immediately asking for relic cases. How can we keep the objects that we're starting to acquire safe in the house? The first items that are brought into Mount Vernon after the ladies kind of vacate it as a residence are a mix of actual Washington-owned objects and stuff that looked old. Some stuff wasn't even old, but it looks kind of old. And again, we have to think about their limitations. All of the Williamsburg and all of this didn't exist. So the knowledge that we all take for granted about the history of American decorative arts wasn't there. The first thing to return to Mount Vernon after the MVLA purchases the property is the harpsichord. They recognize this as very symbolic. It arrives through Nellie Custis's daughter-in-law, Hester Lewis, in 1860. And the harpsichord, and I'm showing you here a page from Benson Lossing's book, is very important because of its ability to tell stories about the family. It's a very human piece of furniture. It's not just a chair. I sat in it. I got up. You have to play it in order to make it work. And so there's all these stories that can come from an object like the harpsichord. You can imagine Washington standing, watching Nellie play, very proud grandpa. And this is a very nice thing. So objects like the harpsichord that come in early to the house are wonderful because they allow the ladies to start making this feel like a home and allow visitors to start imagining Washington here. Other stuff is filler. And we see the Lafayette bedchamber as interpreted by Mrs. Halsted. She wanted to get her room done first so that she would have an example to show all the other ladies. You guys better get in line. And so, a lot of the things were brought from the ladies' families and from their own homes. And then as Washington-owned items were given, as Washington-owned items were purchased, then these things were kind of replaced and taken out. And so we see the house growing more authentic. I know that's a loaded word, but more authentic over time. So this is the stuff that's in the house. How did they know how to put it together? With no precedent or comparable examples, how did the ladies know how to arrange items in the house? My guess is that they were inspired by historical tableaus, which they were all doing, which were very, very popular amongst their middle and upper middle class and elite peers in the United States. Reenactment of colonial domestic scenes were very popular fundraisers by the mid-century and certainly by the centennial. One very popular thing was to reenact Daniel Huntington's extraordinarily authentic, right? Painting Lady Washington's reception, which is a very European reception here, Lady Washington. And Harper's Weekly, always looking to please its readers, even gives a handy-dandy cheat sheet identifying each of the people in the painting. And this is the kind of thing that would have been used by women of the early ladies' class to recreate colonial life. I'm going to play Mrs. Washington, and so I'm going to get all dressed up, and we're going to actually reenact this painting, and we'll spend the evening playing our roles and pretending like we're in colonial times. And one of the really fun things I found in the archives here at Mount Vernon was a program from a fundraiser held in the 1880s for Mount Vernon in South Carolina, my current home state, in which they were reenacting this painting. So I know they were doing this. They were using it to raise money for Mount Vernon. So I think that setting the stage, kind of inhabiting the colonial world was something that they were very familiar with. And so they were using that same thought process to create the rooms at Mount Vernon. The resources that the ladies used to know what was where in the house were varied and used very inconsistently in the early years. And of course, there's no curatorial practice. So this is understandable. The guiding light for the curators at Mount Vernon today, is of course the inventories made of the house after Washington and Martha's deaths. They knew about the inventory and they were using the inventory, although not necessarily consistently. So this is the dining room as it appeared in 1884. This is the South Carolina room. This is Lucy Pickens, and she used the inventory. She identifies the mahogany sideboard listed in the inventory as this piece here, the Aiken piece that came from Philadelphia. And in fact, this is in the room well until the 1960s. So she's thinking about the inventory. She wants to get it right, but then she's also thinking about representing her home state of South Carolina. So we see, Moultrie, we see some South Carolinians on the wall, including in the corner, and Pamela Cunningham, who is of course a South Carolinian. The bust in the front of this room was given by the Masons of South Carolina. Thank you, Masons. We're going to recognize your contribution. And then, of course, it's on a column of palmetto wood, the state tree of South Carolina. So there's this mix of things happening, using historic documents, but also wanting to represent pride in her home state. Next door, Miss Georgia, the vice regent for Georgia, Philoclea Eve, she claimed that she had no idea what this room had been used for. So either she didn't know about the inventory or she wanted to pretend she didn't know. And this is, to me, really interesting because it shows how kind of not necessarily in contact all of the ladies were with one another. The rooms were more or less being curated individually. So she decorated this room as Martha Washington's sitting room, and she calls it something that would she says that she felt it would certainly amply gratify its former owner, is what she says. So we don't really know what happened in here, but I'm sure Martha Washington would have liked it. And in fact, this room is criticized by visitors at the end of the 19th century as being too modern. So people were critical of their interpretations. Across the hall, Elizabeth Broadwell, who's the vice regent from Ohio, had a distinct advantage in the harpsichord. She had this authentic object. We know exactly where it was. There's all these stories associated with it. And she does something that is done in the mansion and every historic house museum today, which is create a tableau. She uses this flute, which people thought at the moment Washington had played, and sets it on the edge of the piano, giving you the idea that, oh, Nellie just got up and George just put down the flute and they had this beautiful duet in this grandpa-granddaughter moment. So there's a range of strategies happening here for how to make Mount Vernon feel like Washington's home. But the house was still a curiosity cabinet of relics in some respects. I'm showing you two images on the left of either side of the new room. And the new room becomes the kind of catch-all for objects that don't really fit anywhere else. And in fact, when the ladies first acquire the harpsichord is first exhibited in the new room. It becomes a museum. It's a very large space, and in many cases, it's the first space that visitors would have entered. One of the just juicy bits I found when I was doing my research is that the current way in which we go through the house, the route we take, was established in the 1890s, which is pretty incredible. But so this was a room that people would have spent some time in. I'm going to wander around. I'm going to look at things. And so they kind of put a bunch of things in here that don't fit anywhere else. The most obvious of which is the gigantic painting by Rembrandt Peale that was given by his daughter of Washington, a wonderful object that's now at the well, can we call it the Corcoran anymore? But it's still in that building. But this painting is very, very large, and so there's no other place to put it but in the new room. And it was never in Mount Vernon. They knew that, but they were very honored to have this painting. They put it up against a window, which causes significant damage to the painting. But of course, there was nowhere else to put it again, and so it eventually goes to the Corcoran for repairs. But there's other objects in the room. You see on the upper right, there's the model of the Bastille made out of a piece of the Bastille. There's a cabinet that has all sorts of documents and clothing and different kinds of things. And I'm also showing you again a photograph of the little parlor, which Mrs. Broadwell knew did not have a piece of case furniture in it, but they had all of these wonderful relics, and people kept giving them things, and they're important. We want to show them. And so pieces of case furniture were introduced into rooms where they knew they hadn't been, in order to hold all of these objects. This is a problem. And the ladies recognized that having relics and having these bulky cases that were not in the house originally is a problem. They interrupt the domestic tableaus. They ruin that kind of, or mar that feeling that Washington just left the room when there's a case of his spectacles and all, his different accoutrements next to it. And this becomes increasingly a problem as the ladies' financial situation improves and as people really start to trust them and give them things and they're able to purchase things. Nancy Halston and the other early ladies worried about this, and they start talking about building a freestanding museum to house relics that didn't fit into the domestic setting in the 1880s. This is remarkable. Nancy Halsted says in 1889 that the MVLA would never have, quote, the home of Washington as it should be until we have a museum. Whoa. Okay. Why didn't it happen? They debate, and part of it was money, at least in that very early 1880s moment. They were just really getting financially solvent by the 1890s. Why didn't it happen? Well, they go back and forth. There's a lot of debate. No one wanted to add a new building. They recognized the value in this tremendous collection of 18th century buildings. They recognized that this was perhaps the most intact collection of 18th century plantation buildings, and they didn't want to add anything to it. So stuff stayed in the mansion. This was the compromise. Do we want to have a new building that's clearly modern, or do we want to leave the stuff in the cases in the house? They go back and forth. Well, by the early 1920s, this becomes a real problem because the collection of relics had grown considerably, and they wanted a safe place to keep. And they used the word relics. The collection of objects that did not fit the domestic simulation had grown. So they hire an architect named Milton Bennett Metairie Jr. To build a relic house on the north lane just behind the spinning house. And they're guided by recent archaeology done by their then superintendent, Colonel Dodge, in which he'd been digging holes, as he did a lot, and he found what he thought were the foundation of the house or quarters for families, which I've pointed out with this big arrow. Great, this is the solution, right? We know there was a building here during Washington's time, so putting another building here is going to be just great. This is going to be the solution to all of our problems. Well, Metairie did his job a little bit too well in his research, and he realized that Washington had the quarters for families taken down before his death in 1799. Well, sad face again. If Washington didn't want a building there, we in the 20th century shouldn't build a building there. So we need to find a new solution. So Metairie works with the board, and they decide to retrofit an outbuilding on the North Lane as a relic house. And we now know this building as the Salt House, but then it had been used for 4 decades as a carpenter shop. It was called the Carpenter Shop. And so Metairie and the ladies decide this is the best building. It's right next to the house. Nobody's going to miss it on their visit to Mount Vernon. They can see all the relics, and then they can go through the house. So they gut the building. They pour a concrete floor. They line the interior with fireproof tile, and they install a rudimentary ventilation system. Very quickly, and you can see the interior here, very quickly this proves unsatisfactory. One is that it's very small. And their collection, there's no place to go. There's no place to grow the collection. The other problem is that humidity was a major issue in this building. And Metairie comes back again and again because there are mushrooms growing in the exhibit cases. And I'm not exaggerating. And this is really bad. This is really, really bad. And they say, we really need a solution. So, okay, there's mushrooms growing on the relics. The threat of the new building is we just got to build it. We just got to build it. We can't wait anymore. And so they go back to Metairie's original plan and build a fireproof museum on the site of what they thought was the quarter for families right behind the old spinning house. And these pictures are from the restoration files, which are just terrific, where you can see it under construction. This is a concrete block structure, because of course this has got to be fireproof, holding all these very important objects. And then the details, Metairie literally lifts from the spinning house. If you go on the North Lane today and you start to compare the eaves, he was measuring the spinning house and then kind of putting the details on the new museum. The museum not only had exhibit space on the first floor, but also solved 2 other perennial issues on the grounds. I had a cement basement for storage of the association's records, which were up until this point kept in one of the 18th century outbuildings. It also, on the second story, had sleeping quarters, modern sleeping quarters for the ladies to stay in when they came for council. And this was really important by the 1920s because they were still sleeping in the house, or some of them were still sleeping in the house when they came for council, and they knew that they needed to stop that practice. So this solved a great solution. It also provided some bathrooms and necessary facilities that were really needed for the board. Now, I think this story is absolutely imperative. This is, unless you can give me another example, and I am totally open to that, this is the first purpose-built separate museum built at a historic house museum. So the visitor centers that we all walk through on our way to every historic house, most of those don't really come along until the 1970s. A lot of them are constructed in anticipation of crowds for the bicentennial. A lot are then built in the 80s. And this is the 1920s. This is 1928, 29. So this is a very early consideration of the visitor experience that is now common practice at most house museums. The impact on the mansion cannot be overestimated. And here's the new room, as it is interpreted for George Washington's bicentennial in 1932. This museum freed the interiors of the mansion finally to be fully interpreted as domestic simulations. We get finally in the 1920s back to that vision from 1859, 1860 of restoring Washington's home to what it was. So stay tuned for the book. It'll be University of Virginia Press, fall 2016. And you can hear about all the other firsts that this amazing organization has had in the past. Thank you very much. can take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Were they affected by the, as far as getting money and objects by the Depression?
They were in pretty good financial shape by the Depression. I didn't see the Depression stopping much happening. It was, the early 1930s was an extremely busy time at Mount Vernon because of the bicentennial. They also, in the 1930s, established their first dedicated research department. So there is a flurry of activity happening around the mansion and to the mansion because of the research that's generated from that office. The bigger impact is by World War II. They start planning the greenhouse reconstruction, which is they saw as the last Washington era building that wasn't there anymore. They wanted to reconstruct that as in the early 40s, late 1930s, but that's put off until after the war. So I think that has a bigger impact. Yes, Claire.
Mount Vernon must be one of the most heavily photographed interiors in the world.
Yes.
Ever. I mean, ever. And these ladies were here, dragging the furniture around. Many of them, these were upper class ladies. They were probably working with decorators in their own personal lives and bringing that knowledge with them.
Some of them brought their decorators. They did.
And so I would like to posit the fact that it also is a kind of history of the unfolding of interior decoration in America, not just the First House Museum, but a real history of interior decorating.
Absolutely. I think that's a great observation, and it's certainly true. The rooms say more about the moment in which they were created in most cases than they do about the 18th century. And the photography is a really interesting point. Mount Vernon is the most photographed building or house, certainly, I think, other than maybe the White House. But the ladies know this from the very beginning. And one of the more interesting kind of nuggets I found in my early research was they take control over the licensing of photographs of the mansion right after the Civil War. They don't let people take pictures without their permission. They commission photographs expressly. They develop particular relationships with particular photographers. They want to control the image, literally, of the house. And so they're very much aware of that from a very early period, which is something I found fascinating. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the lesser furniture?
Do you want to answer that one?
Well, that's a continuing challenge. Many pieces are still here. Many pieces have historical association in their own right. Some pieces that were brought in, as Lydia suggested, to furnish the rooms to be lived in, continued to be used to furnish the quarters that the ladies stayed in over the years, or to be used as sometimes as office furniture. And so it is something that we continue to think about and wrestle with.
One more. Yes.
Any of the ladies staying in the house in those days report any unusual?
I have not seen any ghost stories, if that's what you're asking for. No. But that's another interesting thing that I tracked, was initially many of the outbuildings were restored so that they could serve as quarters because there was no place to stay. And this was such an isolated place at the end of the 19th century. And so, where the staff that lives on site and where the board will stay is a constant issue until the 1950s, when it's finally solved with the construction of the present quarters. Thank you.
I know everybody will be eager to leave, but I just want, again, to thank everyone, particularly the donors who made this possible, the Felicia Fund, the Sachem Foundation, Pauline Metcalf and her idea, and to all of the staff at Mount Vernon, all across the estate, for making this possible, for convening this. It's just been fantastic. And it occurs to me that the tricentennial is not far off. And you know, I expect that particularly many of our young speakers at this conference might very well be here. I might even be in my wheelchair, and I'll try to make it back for that. But I mean, this continues. This is a living story, and this is what propels the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to this day. You know, not to let the side down, not to let the ladies down who did those remarkable things in those days. But 2032 is not far off. Very exciting. Thank you so much for coming. Stephen will have something to say.